Hi there. In this video, I interview Roger Hunter. Roger is the Manager of People and Culture at Adelaide Hills Council, and recently Roger went through an investigation from SafeWork regarding their processes to manage psychosocial risks. I asked Roger a series of questions around this, and he shares his experience with the regulator. I hope you find this to be an insightful interview.
We became aware of the investigation through the media. And it was a journalist who was asking us what our response was to the SafeWork investigation, which was a little bit awkward because we'd never heard of it and weren't aware of it. So that's how we became aware of it. They knew before us that apparently a complaint had been lodged with SafeWork. We then had would have been about a week to 10 days later before there was a formal communication from SafeWork about it. And it was because an investigation had been done apparently by the union, and they had lodged that investigation with SafeWork. And so SafeWork then came out to ask us questions about our practices and our procedures. They don't, I found it interesting because they don't share a copy, because the investigation was anonymous, then they don't share a copy of that. They tell you, in our experience, they told us, here's the kind of areas that it covers. They didn't give us specifics around it. And then they asked us various questions about things like our policies, our procedures, how we manage our risks, the registers, and a couple of things about some of the ways in which psychosocial hazards and incidences can be reported. I think the interesting aspect I find throughout most of this is what people think the regulator is going to be looking for compared to what the regulator looks for, and also the opportunity that there is in working with the regulator to pick up on things, because I think the regulator's in a really interesting space where it's able to get the experience from lots and lots of different places and organizations. So if you work with the regulator, you actually have access to a wealth of information that you may only ever get from having gone through that personal experience. And obviously that's far more valuable. So while the regulator would ask us questions about our policies and procedures, there were some of the issues around reporting, and this idea of how you report is a very new thing around the psychosocial hazards. Particularly, I think, because most of us have a work health and safety framework where if there's an incident or a hazard, you want to report that in a way that almost as many people in the organization know about it so that they're aware of it. One of the things that was really highlighted to me was that when that comes to psychosocial hazards, that's not something that you want. And in fact, if lots of people were suddenly aware of it, it can reduce the likelihood of reports being made. And ironically, it would increase the level of hazard that there are is if lots of people became aware of that incident. So I think that for me was a sudden kind of like aha, both in those two areas, around the fact that the way in which we report it has to be looked at entirely different from the way in which we report physical. The other aspect being the regulator's got a wealth of information that's probably really useful and helpful for other organizations to know about. Yeah, so the internal reporting processes, they talked about an example of if, let's say, for example, one of your workers is sexually assaulted, and how do they report that? Now, that's not the kind of information that you want anybody to have to report to lots of different people. So normally when we report an injury, it would go to the work health and safety officer, maybe the manager, the people and culture manager, their director, that kind of thing. That is, and you're like, oh yeah, you really don't want that kind of reporting process around these kind of areas, around that. And that, I think, for me is a real, I wouldn't say it's an aha moment, but it's a sudden, oh, this is not just about adding in lots of new things that can be reported. This has to be dealt with and looked at in an entirely different way. I think for me, there's one, if there are genuine issues, you always want to know what the genuine issues are, because then you can do something about them. So this idea that going out and asking the questions, the alternative is I'm not going to ask the questions and I'm never going to find anything, which means I'm never going to have to deal with it. I'm not aware of that ever having worked out well in almost anything. So going out, there's nothing wrong in going out and ask. I don't think there's anything wrong in going out and asking the questions. The key is, what is the question that you're asking, and is it about a genuine understanding of psychosocial risk factors? If you're asking the question, at any point in your career, have you ever been stressed? That's not the same as I am currently working in a stressful environment, or that work is a significant contributor. So it's around I think there's going to be a real art and nuance to being able to ask the right questions around this. I think this is where there's a real art that's going to come in the next couple of years for organizations, is knowing what is the questions that helps us identify the genuine challenges that we're facing. I think for me, the most important thing is to take this as a learning opportunity. So we didn't take it as an issue, like a negative thing. We took it more as we were able to work with somebody that's got probably a wider range of experience. And like I say, that example in which the regulator said, well, how are they able to report either confidentially or anonymously? And it was like, our current system doesn't allow us to do that. Now, our current system is one that's used by an awful lot of councils, and which means that it's an issue in the system. And we just haven't worked that through, and we're now working that through with the system provider, that we need this additional functionality to allow us to do that. I think also we were asked for various information. We provided the information, and that then allows the regulator to say, here's the bits that you've got right. Because what the regulator is not there to, I don't believe the regulator is there to point out that you have done it wrong as such. The regulator is there to be able to help you make sure that you get it right. And so everything that we looked at has been able to help us do that. So the way in which what the regulator has asked for is things which are going to help improve our organization. That would be my biggest advice about it. It's not to take this necessarily as something that I need to be fearful of. This is an opportunity for us to be able to do the right thing. And if I am missing out on something, then somebody can actually help me get to where I need to get to. There's the two key areas, and one is going to be our culture and where we're heading, and then the other is going to be your processes and procedures. Now, in our case, the regulator was particularly interested in our processes and procedures, in part because the report that had been put in, and it's in the media around this, so I'm not speaking out of turn on this. The report that was put in didn't name individuals. And so the regulator wasn't able to go into specific examples. So the regulator had more of a focus around how are complaints, internal organization complaints, what's your policies and procedures? How do these work? Do they align? Are they up to date? All of these kind of things. So there is that whole part of it. And I think that's always a really important part. But for me, I wouldn't say the more important bit, but the bit that should never be forgotten about is your culture. And culture works entirely different. And that's where I see things like psychosocial surveys, which are then able to give you clear scores so that you can then go, well, here's where we're starting at. And then here's the initiatives that we put in place. And then are they improving our culture? Because to be honest, a lot of the psychosocial aspects are essentially, this is the type of culture that we've got. Do we have good organizational justice? Do I feel safe? And we would want people to be able to feel safe in organizations so that they can speak up. We know that if we look at our organizations, we all want to increase our outcomes. But for us to be able to increase our outcomes, that requires us to take better actions. For us to take better actions, we need to make better decisions, and better decisions are made from having better information. The way in which we get better information in no matter what area it is that we're talking about within an organization is by having better conversations. So we need to be able to create environments where people are able to have better, respectful, open, transparent conversations, because that's the bit that's going to help us get the better outcomes within the organization and for the individuals. I guess it would depend on the report that's put into the regulator. So in our case, it was an anonymous report and an investigation that was put in by the union. But what they talked about was not specific examples of an incident. And what that does, and so I would imagine that there would be cases where the regulator has received very, very clear examples or a specific complaint about a specific behavior, and they would then go and deal with that, which they should from a safe work perspective. In our case, it was more generalized opinions from what I understand. Like I said, we didn't see a copy of the report, so we're not 100% sure on that. And so because of that, then the regulator focuses on, in our case, the regulator focused on, do you have the right processes and procedures? I think for me, I'm always fascinated by the idea that, like, as a species, we've been around for it's estimated about 10,000 generations, okay, which is a long time, and most of those generations have been all about physical safety. So we survive from being physically safe and creating physically safe environments. If you look at evolution, we adapted for that. It's only in the last, out of those 10,000 generations, the pyramids were built 1,000 generations ago. It's within that time frame, it's not very long. We've only had hot showers for 4 generations. So for like 10,000 generations of human history, it's only in the last 4 that we've had hot showers. We've got this huge evolutionary aspect around safety, which now is not dependent upon the physical safety. So most of us, and not all of us, but most of us live in a relatively physically safe world. We still have the exact same reactions to a snarky email as we would have from being faced with a saber-toothed tiger. Okay, that's part of our evolution. And so I think there's a fascinating aspect around how do we create those safe environments for individuals while we're also working with our evolution, which has done us so well for the entirety of our history. And not being able to manage that and then not being defensive about it. So you would see this almost within every conversation. Am I going to go towards that verbal violence or silence? Am I going to, arc up, or I'm going to shut down? That's our evolution coming into play here. And this, I think, is why it's so important for us to create safe environments from a psychosocial perspective, because whenever we do either one of those two responses, then we're not getting the information. And I think it's a fascinating challenge that to be able to do that, we are having to work with 10,000 generations of evolution, which right up until relatively recently have worked really, really well for us. But the technological advances we've got within society have now put us in this fascinatingly new space that our evolution hasn't actually kept up with. Like I read recently, there was apparently the reason why we're so distractible is from an evolutionary perspective, because it's a really good thing to be distracted by new things. Because if you imagine if you're walking along in the savannah and there's a rustling, you want to have your immediate attention on that to then work out whether it's danger or not. We've now moved to the point where that doesn't happen, but now I'm distracted by my inbox from the same thing, but it doesn't help us, because now we're trying to find, I want to do deep work and need to find 2-3 hours to focus. So I think there's a fascinating aspect of managing that safety for people. And it's like you mentioned before, what's the question that I should ask? And some people might not want to ask the questions. Am I better to just leave it and not ask the question and find out in case I unearth something? That would be a protective mechanism that we've got. So I think it's on us as individuals and within our leadership to then go, I'm comfortable enough to be able to ask these questions, find out what the real issues are, and then be confident enough to be able to start to put stuff in place to be able to resolve it. And I think that's where, things like the psychosocial surveys are going to be able to come in. Things like the one that you've got, which covers off on different areas, allows individuals to then be able to go, well, here's the area that I need to focus on next. Thank you, and looking forward to finding opportunities for us to work together on this, because I've been following a lot of your stuff on that you post about. And I think it's really important that we find people that have a genuine knowledge and understanding of what's happening in this area, as opposed to it's just another thing that we need to tick off on.